This presentation, we're going to identify the indirect and direct impacts of biofuels, and we can also know or enlighten ourselves about the issue when it comes to land use change and access to land. Today, we're going to tackle all about biofuels, land use change, and access to land. But first, what is biofuels? Biofuels is involved in converting biomass such as crops, algae, or waste materials into fuels like methanol or biodiesel. While biofuels are promoted as a renewable source of energy that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, their production has a significant implications to land use change and access to land. Today, the use of biofuels has expanded throughout the globe. Some of the major producers and users of biogases are Asia, Europe, and America. There are several factors that decide the balance between biofuel and fossil fuel use around the world. Those factors are cost, availability, and food supply. There's only so much land fit for farming in the world, and growing biofuels necessarily detracts from the process of growing food. As the population grows, our demands for both energy and food grow. At this point, we don't have enough land to grow both enough biofuel and enough food to meet both needs. Biofuels, land use, and emissions. Why do most food-based biofuels in Europe increase, not reduce carbon dioxide emissions? Well, European Union biofuels mandate have created extra demands for crops, increasing the overall demand for farmland. When existing agricultural land is used to make biofuels, agricultural production has to expand elsewhere. To meet the world's growing demand for food and animal feed, this pressure for new land leads to deforestation, peatland drainage, and conversion of grassland for farming. Causes a substantial increase in carbon dioxide emissions. This change of land use. A phenomenon known as Indirect Land Use Change or ILUC when these indirect emissions are accounted for, European Union biodiesel from food crops is worse for the climate than fossil diesel. A land area the size of Ireland would be needed to meet the European biofuels forecast for 2020. Better alternatives exist such as sustainable advanced biofuels and renewable electricity. One football pitch planted with food crops can power 2.4 cars for 1 year. One football pitch covered with solar panels can power 260 electric bases.
So now, let's move on to land use change or LUC. Land use change or LUC is a critical environmental issue with significance for biodiversity, climate change, and resource management. This process can be categorized into two primary types, the direct land use change and the indirect land use change. Ang kaning direct land use change, mahitabo ni siya when the land is directly converted from its natural states to a new use kasagaran ni siya mahitabo for agricultural purposes. Involves clearing forests, grasslands, or wetlands to cultivate crops including biofuel, feedstock. Some of the example of direct land use change is deforestation. So there are many tropical regions nga ilang mga forest is nangahawa na. Ipamutol ang mga kahoy to make plantations. Napoy ubang mga lugar na pamutol ang mga kahoy to create houses or to build establishment. Direct land use change has negative impacts to our environment. It may result to loss of biodiversity. Tungod sa deforestation, daghang plants, daghang kahoy ang mga wagtang. And also, it can lead to climate change. That's why it is very important to understand the consequence of direct land use change to mitigate its negative impact to our environment. Next, indirect land use change. Mahitabo ni siya when food crops displaced by biofuels feedstock move to new areas, potentially causing environmental impact. Example ana niya kay urbanization and agricultural expansion. Of course, ibang usa ka lungsod o ibang usa ka city mo dako, mataas pud ang demand sa pagkaon ug sa uban nga agricultural crops. Tungod ana, farmers may lead to clear forest or convert grassland to grow more crops. It may result to deforestation, soil degradation, and habitat loss.
Impact on access to land. First, displacement of local communities. Large-scale biofuel projects may lead to land acquisitions that displace smallholders or indigenous communities, reducing their access to fertile land. Second, land grabbing. In some cases, investors acquire large tracts of land in developing regions, often at the expense of local populations. This raises ethical concerns about fairness and human rights. Large-scale biofuel projects can have devastating effects on local communities, particularly indigenous peoples and smallholder farmers. The conversion of forest and conservation areas to biofuel crops leads to widespread displacement, threatening their access to fertile land and ancestral territories. Here are some key impacts on local communities. First, loss of ancestral land. Biofuel projects often result in acquisition large tracts of land, forcing indigenous communities off their ancestral territories. Second, displacement and migration. Communities are displaced, leading to cultural disruption, loss of traditional livelihoods, and social fragmentation. Next, human rights violation. Land grabbing raises ethical concerns about fairness, human rights, and disregards for indigenous people's right to their land. Next, environmental degradation. The expansion of biofuel crops contributes to deforestation, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem degradation. The next one is economic injustice. Local populations often receive inadequate compensation or benefits from land acquisition, exacerbating economic disparities. Who are the vulnerable group of people during this issue? First, indigenous people. Their cultural survival and identity are closely tied to their ancestral lands, making displacement particularly devastating. Next is smallholder farmers. Losing access to fertile land jeopardizes their livelihoods, food security, and economic stability. How to address these issues? First, recognition of indigenous rights. Respecting communal land rights and acknowledging indigenous peoples' ecological knowledge is essential for sustainable. Next is transparency and accountability. Ensuring fair land acquisition processes, adequate compensation, and environmental impact assessment can mitigate negative consequences. Lastly, supporting sustainable livelihoods, promoting agroecology, permaculture, and community-led initiatives can help maintain biodiversity and ensure food sovereignty.